I remember the sound of the rain before I remember anything else. It wasn't the kind of rain that announces itself. No thunder, no wind, just a steady tapping against the window that made the whole apartment feel smaller, darker, like the world outside had folded in on itself. I was standing by the door, my jacket already on, keys in my hand, trying to find the right moment to leave. Julian was sitting on the edge of the couch, hunched forward with his elbows on his knees, holding a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. The amber liquid caught the light from the lamp behind him, but his face was mostly in shadow. I could see enough to know his eyes were red, though he hadn't cried in front of me. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Julian wasn't the type to break down easily, and I think that made it worse, watching him hold everything inside like it might kill him if he let it out. His partner had left only a few hours earlier. I didn't know all the details. Julian had called me around 7, his voice flat and distant, and asked if I could come over. He didn't say why. He didn't have to. I knew the tone. I'd heard it once or twice before, years ago, back when we were younger and life still felt like something we could control. So I came. I always came. The apartment felt hollow now. It had always been neat, almost too neat, like something out of a catalog. Clean lines, muted colors, everything in its place. But tonight it felt staged, like a set waiting for actors who would never arrive. There were small absences everywhere. A gap on the bookshelf, an empty hook by the door, a closet left half open. The kind of details you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for them, unless you knew what used to be there. I should have said something. I should have asked if he was okay, if he wanted to talk, if there was anything I could do. But the silence between us felt too heavy to break, and I didn't trust my own voice not to crack under the weight of it. So I just stood there, one hand on the doorknob, my thumb pressed against the cold metal, staring at the floor and pretending I was waiting for the right moment to say goodbye. That's when he spoke. "Don't go yet." His voice was low, barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the room like a blade. I froze. My hand stayed where it was, but my body had stopped obeying me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't, because I knew if I looked at him, if I saw the way his face would be open and raw and asking for something I didn't know how to give, I wouldn't be able to leave at all. The rain kept falling. The room stayed dim, and I stood there, caught between the door and the man I'd known for more than half my life, feeling the pull of something I'd spent years pretending didn't exist. I told myself I was staying because he was my friend, because he was hurting, because it was the right thing to do. But even then, standing in that doorway with my heart hammering against my ribs, I knew it wasn't that simple. It had never been that simple. Not with Julian. Not with us. So I let go of the doorknob. I took off my jacket. And I stayed. I suppose I should explain how we got here. How two people can know each other for so long and still end up standing in a doorway, suspended between leaving and staying, between what's been said and what never will be. Julian and I met in college, back when everything felt temporary and permanent at the same time. We were in the same literature seminar, one of those small classes where you can't hide in the back and pretend you've done the reading. He sat 2 seats away from me, and I remember thinking he looked like someone who had already figured out how to be an adult while the rest of us were still pretending. He had this way of speaking that made even simple observations sound considered, deliberate. I envied that about him. We became friends slowly, the way you do when you're not trying too hard. Study sessions that turned into late dinners. Dinners that turned into walks across campus, talking about books and movies and all the small philosophies we thought mattered back then. He was easy to be around. He didn't demand anything from you, didn't need you to perform. With Julian, silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was just another way of being together. After graduation, we stayed close even as our lives began to diverge. I took a job at a small publishing house, the kind of place that felt noble and underpaid in equal measure. My apartment became a repository for manuscripts and half-finished projects, books stacked on every surface, coffee mugs abandoned on windowsills. I told myself I liked the chaos, that it meant I was living a creative life. But really, I think I just never learned how to build something permanent. My relationships followed the same pattern. They would start with intensity, that electric feeling of discovering someone new, and then they would fade. Not dramatically, not with fights or betrayals. They just dissolved. One day you're talking about moving in together, and the next you're having polite conversations about picking up your things. I told myself I was unlucky, that I hadn't met the right person. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I knew I was always holding something back, always keeping one foot out the door. Julian's life looked different from the outside. He met Marcus in his late 20s, and they built something that appeared solid, stable. They moved in together, got a dog, talked about the future in concrete terms. Julian's apartment reflected that stability. Everything carefully chosen, everything in its place. Minimalist furniture, art on the walls that looked expensive even if it wasn't. A kitchen where people actually cooked instead of just reheating takeout. It was the kind of home that said we have our lives together, we know what we're doing. I visited often enough to know the layout by heart. The living room with its low-slung couch and the bookshelf organized by color. The bedroom door that was always closed when I was there. The kitchen where Julian would make coffee in the morning, moving through the space with the ease of someone who belonged there completely. But there were things I noticed that maybe I wasn't supposed to. The way Julian's voice would change slightly when Marcus was in the room, becoming just a little more performative, a little less himself. The way he would glance at his phone during our conversations, not with excitement, but with something closer to obligation. The way he talked about his relationship in terms that were always rational, always reasonable, never quite reaching the language of joy. I never said anything. It wasn't my place. And besides, who was I to judge? My own track record spoke for itself. At least Julian had managed to build something lasting, even if it sometimes looked more like architecture than intimacy. Our friendship became the constant in both our lives. We'd meet for drinks every few weeks, sometimes more often when one of us was going through something difficult. We'd text about books, about movies, about nothing in particular. He was the first person I called when I got promoted. I was the first person he told when his father died. We had that kind of friendship, the kind where you don't have to explain yourself, where the history is so deep that half the conversation happens in the space between words. I think that's why he called me that night. Not Marcus's friends, not his family. Me. Because I knew him before he became the person he thought he needed to be. Because with me, he could let the carefully constructed facade slip, just a little. When I arrived at his apartment that evening, the rain already starting, I could feel immediately that something had shifted. The air felt different, thinner somehow. Julian opened the door, and I saw it in his face. That look of someone who's been holding themselves together by sheer force of will and is finally starting to fracture. He told me what happened in fragments. The argument that had been building for weeks. The things said that couldn't be unsaid. The realization, on both sides, that they'd been performing a relationship instead of living one. Marcus had packed a bag and left, and now Julian was alone in this apartment that suddenly felt like a museum of a life that had never quite been real. I listened. I didn't offer advice or platitudes. I just sat with him in that hollow space and let him talk. Let him be quiet. Let him exist without having to explain or justify or make sense of anything. And when the hours grew late and I moved toward the door, when I felt the pull of my own apartment and my own life waiting for me across the city, he asked me not to go. His voice cracked on those 3 words, "Don't go yet." And I felt something shift inside me, something I'd been keeping carefully locked away for longer than I wanted to admit. So I stayed. I took off my jacket. I sat back down, and I told myself it was just for tonight, just to help a friend through a difficult moment. But even then, I knew I was lying to myself. I'd been lying to myself for years. That first night stretched out in a way that time doesn't usually move. Minutes felt like hours, and hours collapsed into moments. I remember sitting on the floor beside the couch because it felt less formal than sitting on the furniture, less like I was a guest in someone else's crisis. Julian moved down to join me after a while, his back against the couch, legs stretched out in front of him. We sat like that for a long time, shoulders nearly touching, staring at nothing in particular. He'd ordered food at some point, Thai, I think, though neither of us ate much of it. The containers sat open on the coffee table, steam long since dissipated, the smell of basil and lemongrass filling the apartment. There was music playing, something instrumental and melancholy that Julian had put on without asking if I minded. I didn't. The silence between us needed something to hold it up, to give it shape. We talked, eventually. Not about Marcus, not directly. Julian wasn't ready for that kind of dissection, that kind of clarity. Instead, we talked around it. About how strange it felt to be in your 30s and still not know what you're doing. About the gap between the life you're living and the life you thought you'd have by now. About the small ways you betray yourself without even noticing, day after day, until one day you wake up and don't recognize the person in the mirror. He said he'd been feeling like an actor in his own life for longer than he wanted to admit. Going through the motions, hitting the marks, delivering the lines everyone expected. And the worst part, he said, was that he'd been good at it. So good that even he had started to believe the performance was real. I understood what he meant more than I wanted to. My own life wasn't so different, just arranged in another pattern. Where Julian had built something that looked stable from the outside, I'd built nothing at all. I moved through relationships like someone passing through train stations, never staying long enough to unpack. I told myself it was freedom, that I was keeping my options open. But really, I think I was just afraid. Afraid of what it would mean to stop running, to stand still long enough to see what I was running from. The rain hadn't stopped. It was one of those autumn storms that settles in for the night, steady and patient. Every so often, I'd glance toward the window and see the city lights blurred through the water streaming down the glass. The world outside felt very far away, like we were suspended in some pocket of time that existed separately from everything else. Julian asked me to stay over. He framed it practically at first. It was late, the rain was heavy. I'd have to walk 6 blocks to the subway, and then transfer twice to get home. But I could hear the real request underneath the logistics. He didn't want to be alone. Not tonight. Maybe not for a while. I should have made an excuse. I should have said I had work in the morning, that I needed to get back to my apartment, that I'd check in on him tomorrow. But I didn't. I said yes before I'd even finished thinking about it, and the relief that crossed Julian's face made something in my chest tighten. He gave me clothes to sleep in, a t-shirt that was too big on me, sweatpants I had to roll at the waist. They smelled like his laundry detergent, something clean and faintly cedar. I changed in the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror for longer than necessary, trying to read my own expression, trying to understand what I was doing. The face looking back at me didn't offer any answers. Julian set me up on the couch with blankets and a pillow, apologizing for not having a guest room, for the apartment being too small, for everything and nothing. I told him it was fine. I told him to stop apologizing. He lingered in the doorway to his bedroom for a moment, backlit by the lamp on his nightstand, and I could see him trying to find words that wouldn't come. Finally, he just said goodnight, and the door closed softly behind him. I lay there in the dark, listening to the rain and the distant sounds of the city and the particular silence of someone else's home. I couldn't sleep. My mind was too loud, too full of thoughts I'd been pushing down for years. I kept replaying the moment at the door, the sound of his voice when he asked me not to leave. The way something had shifted in the space between us, subtle but unmistakable, like a plate shifting beneath the earth's surface. I don't know how long I'd been lying there when I heard Julian's bedroom door open. Soft footsteps crossed the apartment. I kept my eyes closed, my breathing steady, pretending to be asleep. I felt him pause near the couch, felt the weight of his presence in the dark. He stood there for what might have been 30 seconds or 3 minutes, and I wondered what he was thinking, what he was looking at, whether he could tell I was awake. Then he moved away, into the kitchen. I heard the tap running, the sound of water filling a glass. He didn't turn on any lights. When he came back through the living room, he paused again, and this time I opened my eyes. He was just standing there in the darkness, holding the glass of water, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. We stared at each other for a long moment, and I felt the air between us shift again, become charged with something neither of us was willing to name. "You okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. Then, after a pause, "Are you?" I didn't answer right away, because the honest answer was no. I wasn't okay. I hadn't been okay for a long time, and being here with him like this was making everything I'd buried rise to the surface. But I couldn't say that. So I just said yeah, and he nodded again, and after another moment of silence, he went back to his room. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about the way he'd looked at me in the dark, the weight of everything unspoken between us. I kept thinking about all the times over the years when I'd felt this pull toward him, this current running beneath the surface of our friendship, and how I'd convinced myself it was one-sided, that it was just my own complicated feelings projected onto someone who could never reciprocate them. But lying there in his apartment, in his clothes, listening to the rain, I started to wonder if I'd been wrong. If maybe, all this time, we'd both been pretending, both performing, both afraid of what it would mean to stop. When morning came, pale light filtering through the windows, Julian emerged from his bedroom, looking like he'd slept even less than I had. We made coffee in silence, moving around each other in the small kitchen with the awkward choreography of two people trying not to acknowledge how intimate the moment was. I should go, I said, though I didn't move toward the door. He nodded but didn't say anything, just stood there holding his coffee mug, looking at me with those tired eyes. I'll call you later, I said. Check in. Okay, he said. And then, quieter, thanks for staying. I wanted to say something else, something that would address the thing hovering between us, but I didn't know what words would even begin to touch it. So I just nodded, gathered my things, and left. But I knew, walking out into the gray morning with rain still misting down, that something had started that night, something that couldn't be easily stopped or ignored. And I knew, too, that I would come back, that when he called, I would answer, that we had crossed some invisible line, and there was no going back to the way things were before. The weeks that followed didn't feel like weeks at all. They felt like a slow dissolve, one day bleeding into the next without clear boundaries. Julian called me the day after I left his apartment, then again 2 days later, then again the day after that. The calls became routine, expected, something I'd wait for without realizing I was waiting. At first, the conversations were about logistics. He was sorting through the remnants of his relationship with Marcus, dividing up furniture and books and all the small artifacts of a shared life. He'd call to ask my opinion on things that didn't really need opinions, whether he should keep the armchair they'd bought together, whether it was petty to want the coffee maker, whether he was being unreasonable. I knew he wasn't actually asking about furniture. He was asking for permission to feel what he was feeling, for someone to witness the dismantling of his life without judgment. So I listened. I became the person he called late at night when the apartment felt too empty. The person he texted in the middle of the workday with observations that didn't quite qualify as conversations. The person who showed up when he asked, which was more and more often. I told myself I was being a good friend, that this was what friendship looked like when someone was going through something difficult. But I knew it was more complicated than that. Every time I walked through his door, every time I settled into the space beside him on that couch, I felt the weight of something unacknowledged growing heavier between us. The nature of our time together began to shift. We'd always been comfortable with each other, but now there was a new kind of ease, something that felt almost domestic. I'd come over after work and find him cooking dinner, something simple, and he'd gesture for me to open the wine. We'd eat together at his small dining table, talking about our days, about books we were reading, about nothing and everything. Afterwards, we'd migrate to the living room, and the evening would unspool in that quiet way evenings do when you're with someone you don't have to entertain. But beneath the ease, there was tension. I started noticing things I'd trained myself not to notice before. The way Julian's hand would rest near mine on the couch, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his skin. The way he'd look at me sometimes when he thought I wasn't paying attention, his expression unguarded, searching. The way he'd find excuses to touch me, a hand on my shoulder when he passed behind me, fingers brushing mine when he handed me something, the kind of casual contact that shouldn't have meant anything, but somehow meant everything. I noticed, too, how the apartment was changing. The sterile perfection that had defined it during his relationship with Marcus was giving way to something more lived in, more honest. Books started appearing on surfaces instead of being confined to shelves. Dishes sat in the sink overnight. The space was becoming less curated, less concerned with presenting a certain image, and I realized that Julian was shedding something, some version of himself he'd been maintaining for too long. One evening, maybe 3 weeks after that first night, we were sitting on the floor again, our backs against the couch, a bottle of wine mostly empty between us. Julian had been quiet for a while, that kind of quiet that feels weighted, like he was working up to something. I waited, watching the city lights through the window, giving him space to find his words. He said he'd been thinking about his life, about the choices he'd made, about the person he'd been trying to be. He said that when he was with Marcus, he'd convinced himself he was happy because the relationship checked all the right boxes. It was stable, it was respectable, it was the kind of thing you were supposed to want. But the truth, he said, was that he'd been performing happiness rather than feeling it. He'd been so focused on building something that looked right from the outside that he'd forgotten to ask whether it felt right from the inside. I asked him what felt right. He was quiet for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was so low I had to lean closer to hear him. "This," he said, "this feels right." I didn't ask him what he meant by this. I didn't want to force him to articulate something he might not be ready to articulate. But I felt my heart rate pick up, felt that familiar mix of hope and fear that I'd been carrying around for weeks, for years, if I was being honest with myself. We stayed there on the floor, not quite looking at each other, the space between us charged with everything we weren't saying. I wanted to reach for him. I wanted to close the gap, to stop pretending I didn't feel what I felt. But I was terrified. Terrified of misreading the moment, of pushing too hard, of ruining the one thing in my life that had always been steady and safe. So I didn't move. Neither did he. We just sat there, and eventually the moment passed, dissolved back into the ordinary rhythm of the evening, and I went home feeling like I'd failed some test I didn't know I was taking. But something had shifted again. The next time I came over, Julian met me at the door with an expression I couldn't quite read. He'd been drinking, I could tell, not drunk, just loosened, his edges softened. We sat on the couch, closer than usual, and I could feel the heat of his body next to mine. We were watching something on television, not really paying attention, and then his hand was on my knee. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was casual, almost absent-minded, the kind of touch that could have been friendly if not for the way it lingered, the way his fingers pressed just slightly into the fabric of my jeans. I froze. My whole body went still, hyper-aware of that single point of contact, of what it might mean, of what acknowledging it might unleash. I looked at him, and he was already looking at me. His eyes were dark, uncertain, and I could see him searching my face for something. Permission, maybe, or reassurance, or just confirmation that he wasn't imagining whatever was happening between us. I should have said something. I should have asked him what he wanted, what he was feeling, where he thought this was going. But words felt impossible, inadequate. So instead, I covered his hand with mine, a simple gesture that somehow said everything. His fingers tightened against my knee, and we sat like that for a long time, hands layered together, the television flickering in front of us, neither of us brave enough to take the next step. He pulled away first, stood up abruptly, and went to the kitchen for water. When he came back, the moment had fractured, and we spent the rest of the evening in that strange space where everything had changed and nothing had changed. I left late, and neither of us mentioned what had happened. But I couldn't stop thinking about the weight of his hand, the look in his eyes, the way the air between us had felt electric and terrifying. The days after that were different. There was an awareness now, an acknowledgement hovering just beneath the surface of our interactions. Julian started sitting closer to me, finding excuses to be in the same room, creating small intimacies that felt both natural and charged. I found myself responding in kind, leaning into the moments, testing the boundaries, trying to understand what we were becoming. We took walks together, long aimless routes through the city that gave us an excuse to be side by side, arms occasionally brushing. We'd stop at cafes and sit across from each other, and I'd watch him talk and think about how long I'd been watching him, how many years I'd spent cataloging the small details of his face and pretending it didn't mean anything. One night, he told me about his childhood, about growing up in a family that had very specific ideas about what a successful life looked like. about learning early on to present the version of himself that would make things easier, that would avoid difficult conversations. He said he'd gotten so good at it that he'd almost forgotten there was another version underneath, a version that wanted different things, felt different things. He looked at me when he said it, and I understood what he was really telling me, that he was starting to remember. That being with me was helping him remember that whatever this was between us, it wasn't just about comfort or convenience or filling the space Marcus had left behind. It was about something older, something that had been there all along, waiting for permission to exist. I wanted to tell him I understood, that I'd been doing the same thing, hiding the same parts of myself, moving through my life like someone playing a role I'd never quite believed in. That every failed relationship, every time I'd pulled away just when things started to get serious, had been because I was comparing everyone to him, measuring every feeling against the impossible standard of what I felt when I was near him. But I didn't say any of that. Not yet. Because saying it out loud would make it real, would demand action, would force us both to decide what we were willing to risk for something that had no guarantees. So instead, I told him I was glad he was figuring things out, that he deserved to live a life that felt true. And he smiled at me, sad and grateful and full of something I was almost ready to name, and said he couldn't have done it without me. We were sitting close enough that I could have kissed him. The thought had been occurring to me more and more lately, at odd moments, intrusive and persistent. I imagined what it would be like to close the distance, to finally stop pretending, to let the thing between us become tangible and real. But I didn't. Not that night. Because I could see that Julian was still unraveling, still figuring out who he was beneath all the layers of performance and protection. And I knew that whatever happened between us needed to come from a place of clarity, not confusion, from choice, not desperation. So I waited. We both waited. And the tension kept building, day after day, moment after moment, until it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. The revelation didn't come the way I'd imagined it would. There was no dramatic build-up, no perfect moment orchestrated by fate. It came on an ordinary Tuesday evening, unremarkable in every way except for what it would become. I'd been at Julian's apartment for hours. We'd fallen into a pattern by then. I'd come over after work 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes more. It had stopped feeling like visiting and started feeling like something else, something I didn't have a name for. That evening, we'd ordered pizza and worked side by side at his dining table, me reading through manuscripts for work, him answering emails. It was comfortable, domestic, the kind of quiet companionship that felt more intimate than conversation. As the evening wore on, I started gathering my things. It was late, later than I'd realized, and I had an early meeting the next morning. I stacked my papers, closed my laptop, went through the familiar motions of preparing to leave. Julian watched me from the table, his expression unreadable. I pulled on my jacket, the same one I'd worn that first night weeks ago, and moved toward the door. My hand found the doorknob, that cold metal that had become such a significant threshold between us, and I turned back to say goodbye. Julian was standing now, halfway between the table and where I stood. The light from the lamp cast half his face in shadow, and there was something in his expression that made me pause. Something raw and unguarded that I'd seen glimpses of, but never this clearly, never this direct. "Don't leave yet," he said. The same words from that first night, but they landed differently now. They weren't a request born of loneliness or fear of being alone. They were something else entirely. Something that made my chest tighten and my hand fall away from the door. I stood there, frozen, watching him watch me. The air between us felt thick, charged with weeks of accumulation, of touches and glances and conversations that had circled around the thing we were both afraid to name. He took a step closer, then another, and I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but wait for whatever was about to happen. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, rough with something that sounded like fear and hope mixed together in equal measure. "I don't know what this is," he said. "I don't know how to explain it, or when it started, or even if it makes any sense. But it feels like it's been waiting for years." My heart was hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. I wanted to tell him I knew exactly what he meant, that I'd been waiting too, that everything I'd been feeling wasn't one-sided or imagined. but the words stuck in my throat, tangled up with all the fear and longing I'd been carrying around for so long. He was close enough now that I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the way his hands were trembling slightly at his sides. He lifted one hand, hesitant, and I thought he might reach for me. Instead, he just let it hover in the space between us, a question without words. I closed the distance. I don't know if it was courage or desperation or just exhaustion from years of pretending, but I moved toward him, and suddenly we were standing so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could hear the unsteady rhythm of his breathing. His hand came up to my face, fingers trembling as they touched my cheek. It was the gentlest contact, barely there, but it felt like everything. Like every moment we'd been building toward had collapsed into this single point of connection. His thumb traced along my cheekbone, and I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by the simple fact of his touch, by the reality of it after so long imagining. When I opened my eyes again, he was looking at me with an intensity that made me feel seen in a way I'd never experienced before. Not just observed, but truly seen. All the parts of myself I'd kept hidden, all the feelings I'd been too afraid to acknowledge. And in his eyes, I saw the same thing reflected back. The same fear, the same longing, the same years of silence finally breaking. I don't remember who moved first. Maybe it was both of us at once, drawn together by something larger than either of our individual choices. But suddenly his lips were against mine, soft and uncertain and devastating in their gentleness. It wasn't the kind of kiss you see in movies, dramatic and sweeping. It was hesitant, exploratory, like we were both afraid the other might disappear if we pressed too hard. His hand stayed against my face, and my hands found his waist, steadying myself against the rush of feeling threatening to overwhelm me. The kiss lasted only a few seconds before he pulled back, his eyes searching mine with something close to panic. I could see him second-guessing, could see the fear rising up as the reality of what we'd just done settled over him. I didn't let him retreat. I tightened my hold on him, kept him close, and kissed him again. Slower this time, more certain, trying to communicate through touch what I couldn't yet put into words. That this wasn't a mistake. That I wanted this. That I'd been wanting this for longer than I was ready to admit. He melted into it, his initial hesitation giving way to something deeper, more desperate. His hands moved to my shoulders, gripping like he was afraid I might slip away. We stood there in his entryway, the door at my back, kissing like we were trying to make up for years of restraint, of careful distance, of pretending we felt less than we did. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing hard, the reality of what had just happened hung between us. Julian's eyes were wide, his lips slightly swollen, his hair mussed where my fingers had tangled in it without me realizing. He looked terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. I should say something, I thought. I should tell him this changes everything, or that I've wanted this for years, or that I'm falling apart just from the feeling of his hands still gripping my shoulders. But all I could manage was his name, spoken so quietly it was almost a breath. He rested his forehead against mine, and we stood like that, not quite kissing but not separate either, existing in some liminal space where everything had shifted and nothing was certain. I don't know what happens now, he whispered. Neither do I said. And it was true. I had no idea what came next, what this meant for us, whether we were about to build something real or destroy the most important friendship I'd ever had. But standing there with his forehead pressed to mine, his breath mingling with my own, I realized I didn't care about the uncertainty. For once in my life, I was willing to step into the unknown without mapping out every possible outcome. We stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the doorway, neither of us willing to be the first to let go. The apartment was quiet around us, the city distant beyond the windows. It felt like we existed in a bubble, suspended outside of normal time, and I wished we could stay there forever, in that moment before reality demanded decisions and consequences. Eventually, Julian pulled back just enough to look at me, his hands sliding from my shoulders to take mine, threading our fingers together. The gesture felt impossibly intimate, more vulnerable somehow than the kiss had been. Stay, he said. Not a question this time. A request. An invitation. A plea. And I realized that we'd been having this conversation for weeks, in every glance and touch and loaded silence. Every time I'd stood at this door, and every time he'd asked me not to leave yet, we'd been asking and answering this same question. Whether I would stay, whether we would do this, whether we were brave enough to reach for something that had been waiting in the shadows of our friendship for longer than either of us wanted to acknowledge. I nodded. I stayed. And the door closed behind us, shutting out the world and everything we'd been before, leaving only the terrifying possibility of what we might become. The morning after was quiet in a way that felt fragile, like speaking too loudly might shatter whatever we'd built the night before. I woke up on Julian's couch, the same couch where I'd slept that first night, though everything felt different now. The blanket was tangled around my legs, early light filtering through the windows, and I could hear movement in the kitchen, the soft clink of mugs, water running, the ordinary sounds of morning that somehow felt extraordinary. Julian appeared in the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee, and the look on his face told me everything I needed to know. The openness from last night had been replaced by something more guarded, more uncertain. He handed me a cup without quite meeting my eyes, and I felt the distance opening between us even as he sat down beside me. We drank our coffee in silence, and I could feel him retreating, pulling back into himself the way people do when reality starts to crowd out possibility. I wanted to reach for him, to remind him of how his hands had felt in mine, how his lips had tasted, how right it had all seemed in the darkness. But I could see that he needed space to process, to figure out what he thought about what we'd done, and I didn't want to push. He called me later that day, his voice careful and measured. He said he needed some time to think, to sort through what he was feeling. He didn't say he regretted it, but he didn't have to. I could hear it in the spaces between his words, in the way he kept apologizing without saying what he was apologizing for. I told him I understood. I told him to take whatever time he needed. But after I hung up, I sat in my apartment staring at my phone, feeling the weight of all those years of wanting pressing down on my chest. I'd finally had a moment of honesty, of connection, and now I was watching it slip away, watching Julian disappear back into the safety of uncertainty. The days that followed were harder than I wanted to admit. Julian didn't call. He responded to my texts with brief, polite messages that felt nothing like the ease we'd built over weeks of constant contact. I tried to give him space while fighting the urge to show up at his door, to demand that he talk to me, to tell me whether what we'd shared meant anything or if it had just been a moment of weakness he was already working to forget. I knew what he was doing. He was retreating back into the familiar pattern of denial, of choosing the path that felt safer even if it meant sacrificing something real. He was scared of what it would mean to acknowledge what he felt, scared of what his family would think, scared of upending the identity he'd spent so many years constructing. And I understood that fear because I'd lived with my own version of it for so long. But understanding didn't make it hurt less. I'd finally let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we could have something real. That all those years of careful distance and unspoken longing might finally resolve into something tangible. And now I was facing the possibility that I'd been wrong, that Julian would choose safety over truth, and I'd be left with nothing but the memory of a single kiss and the ghost of what might have been. A week passed, then another. I stopped texting. I figured if Julian wanted to talk, he knew where to find me. I threw myself into work, stayed late at the office, filled my evenings with anything that would keep me from thinking about him. But he was there anyway, in every quiet moment, in every song that came on the radio, in the weight of my phone in my pocket, silent and accusing. I was angry, I realized. Not just hurt, but genuinely angry. Angry that he'd asked me to stay, that he'd kissed me like I mattered, that he'd made me believe we were finally being honest with each other, only to disappear the moment things got complicated. Angry that I'd let myself hope. Angry that even now, after everything, I still wanted him. When he finally called, almost 3 weeks after that night, I almost didn't answer. I stared at his name on my screen, my thumb hovering over the decline button, torn between the desperate need to hear his voice and the equally desperate need to protect myself from whatever he was about to say. I answered. His voice was rough, like he hadn't been sleeping well. He asked if we could talk, if I could come over. There was something in his tone that made me say yes, even though every instinct told me to protect myself, to not give him another chance to hurt me. When I got to his apartment, he looked different, tired, worn down, like he'd been fighting some internal battle that had left him depleted. He let me in without preamble, and we stood in that same entryway where everything had changed, the memory of that kiss hanging in the air between us. He said he was sorry, that he'd been a coward, that he'd panicked, that he'd spent the last few weeks trying to convince himself that what happened between us was just confusion or loneliness or anything other than what it actually was. But he couldn't. He'd tried to go back to the way things were before, tried to tell himself that he could just forget and move on. But every day that passed, he felt the absence of me more acutely, felt the wrongness of pretending nothing had changed. He said he'd been terrified of what it meant to want me, to want this, of the ways his life would have to change if he admitted the truth, of losing his family's approval, of facing judgment, of stepping into an identity he'd spent his whole life avoiding. But more than any of that, he was terrified of losing me entirely, of letting fear make his decisions and waking up 10 years from now, still pretending, still hiding, still wondering what might have been if he'd been brave enough to choose differently. I stood there listening, my heart pounding, wanting to believe him but afraid to let myself. Because I'd been hurt before, I'd been let down before, and I knew that fear was a powerful thing. I knew that people could mean what they said in the moment and still retreat when things got difficult. I asked him if this was temporary, if he was turning to me because he was lonely, because his relationship with Marcus had ended, because I was familiar and safe. I asked him if I was just a comfort, something to help him through a difficult time until he figured out what he really wanted. Because I couldn't do that. I couldn't be someone's experiment, someone's maybe, someone's secret. He looked at me with an expression so raw it hurt to witness. He said that what he felt with me was more real than anything he'd let himself feel in years. That being with Marcus had been about building the right kind of life, checking the right boxes, being the person he thought he was supposed to be. But being with me, even just sitting with me, talking with me, existing in the same space, had always felt like coming home to himself. He said he didn't have all the answers, that he was still scared, still figuring things out, still learning how to be honest after so many years of performance. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wanted me, not as a friend, not as a temporary comfort, but as something more, something real and lasting and worth the risk. He took a step toward me, and I saw my own fear reflected in his eyes. The fear of vulnerability, of trusting, of reaching for something that could still slip away. But I also saw determination, a quiet resolve that hadn't been there before. I asked him what he was willing to do, what this would mean, how it would work, whether he was ready to stop hiding. Because I couldn't do this halfway. I couldn't be someone he kept in the shadows, someone he only acknowledged in private. I'd spent too many years of my own life holding back, and I was tired of it. If we were going to do this, it had to be real. He said he didn't know what the future looked like. He couldn't promise it would be easy or that he wouldn't struggle with the weight of other people's expectations. But he could promise that he was choosing this, choosing us, choosing to stop running from the truth, even if it meant facing things that scared him. And then he asked me the question that had been hovering between us since that first night, since that first kiss, maybe even since we'd met all those years ago in a college seminar. He asked if I would stay, not just for the night, not just until things got difficult, but really stay. Choose this with him. Take the risk of building something real, even though neither of us knew how it would turn out. I looked at him standing there in the dim light of his apartment, vulnerable and terrified and more honest than I'd ever seen him. I thought about all the years I'd spent moving through life without committing to anything, all the relationships I'd let slip away because they didn't feel right, because something was always missing. And I realized that what had been missing was this. Him. The possibility of us. So I said yes. Yes to staying. Yes to trying. Yes to all of it. Even the uncertain parts. Even the scary parts. Yes to finally choosing something real instead of always keeping one foot out the door. He crossed the distance between us, and when he pulled me into his arms, It felt like falling and flying at the same time, like the culmination of every moment we'd been building toward and the beginning of something entirely new. We stood there holding each other in that entryway, and I felt the shift happen, not just between us, but within me. The fear that had always held me back was still there, but it was quieter now, softer, overshadowed by something stronger. By hope, by the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that maybe, finally, I'd found something worth staying for. The ending, when it comes, is quieter than I expected. Not an ending, really, more like a beginning disguised as an ordinary morning. I wake up in Julian's apartment, but this time it's different. This time I'm in his bed, the sheets tangled around us. Early sunlight streaming through the windows he forgot to close the night before. I can feel the warmth of him beside me, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the weight of his arm across my waist. It's such a simple thing, waking up next to someone, but it feels monumental, like something I've been waiting my whole life to experience. I slip out of bed carefully, trying not to wake him, and make my way to the kitchen. The apartment looks different in the morning light, less like the sterile showpiece it used to be, more lived in, more honest. There are books stacked on the coffee table, dishes from last night's dinner still in the sink, my jacket draped over a chair. Small signs of a life being lived rather than curated. I make coffee, the familiar ritual grounding me in the reality of where I am, what's happened, what we've chosen. The machine hisses and gurgles, filling the quiet apartment with sound and the rich smell of brewing coffee. I find 2 mugs in the cabinet, not matching. I notice, and I smile at this small indication of change. Julian appears in the doorway while I'm pouring, his hair messy from sleep, wearing the same t-shirt he'd slept in. He looks soft in the morning light, younger somehow, less burdened by the weight he's been carrying. He watches me for a moment, and I can see him taking it in. Me, here, in his kitchen, making coffee like I belong. "Morning," he says, his voice still rough with sleep. "Morning," I say back, and hand him a mug. We stand there in the kitchen, drinking our coffee, not saying much. But the silence feels different now. Not weighted with things unsaid, but comfortable. Easy. Like we've finally figured out how to exist in the same space without pretending. Through the window, I can see the city waking up. People heading to work, cars moving through streets, the ordinary machinery of life carrying on. In here, though, time feels slower, more deliberate. Like we're existing in our own pocket of reality, separate from everything else. Julian sets his mug down on the counter and moves closer to me. His hand finds mine, fingers threading together with the same gentle certainty they had that night in the doorway. He doesn't say anything, just looks at me with an expression that's open and unguarded and real. I think about all the years that led us here, all the careful distance, the friendships that never quite became what they could have been, the performances we both gave to avoid facing the truth. I think about that first night, the rain against the window, the sound of his voice asking me not to go. I think about how we've been circling this moment for so long, afraid of what it would mean to step into it. And now here we are. No grand declarations, no certainty about what comes next. Just 2 people standing in a kitchen, holding hands, choosing to be honest about what they feel, even though it's terrifying. Julian's thumb traces small circles on the back of my hand, and I realize this is what I've been searching for in all those failed relationships, all those almosts and not quites. Not perfection, not certainty, but this, someone who sees me completely and chooses to stay anyway. Someone who makes me want to stop running. The coffee grows cold in our mugs. The morning stretches on. Neither of us moves to break the moment, to rush into whatever comes next. We just stand there, and it's enough. More than enough. Eventually, Julian speaks. His voice is quiet, almost tentative, but there's a steadiness underneath that wasn't there before. He says he doesn't know what the future looks like, that there will be difficult conversations ahead, people who won't understand, moments when the fear will try to pull him back into hiding. But he knows he doesn't want to face any of it without me. That whatever comes next, he wants to face it honestly, as himself, with me beside him. I tell him I'm not going anywhere, that I'm done running, done pretending, done settling for less than what's real. That whatever we're building here, I want to build it with him. His eyes are bright with something that looks like relief, like gratitude, like hope. He leans in and kisses me, soft and unhurried. And I taste coffee and morning and the promise of something new. When we pull apart, I rest my forehead against his, and we stay like that for a long moment. Two people who've finally stopped pretending, who've finally chosen truth over safety, who've finally admitted that what they have is worth fighting for. The apartment is quiet around us. The city continues beyond the windows. And we stand together in the kitchen, in the morning light, holding each other like we're afraid to let go. But we're not afraid. Not anymore. Not of this. I reach across the space between us and take his hand again, and he holds on tight. It's a simple gesture, just our hands clasped together on the kitchen counter, but it carries the weight of everything we've been through, everything we've chosen, everything we're becoming. The steam has stopped rising from our coffee mugs. The morning is beginning in earnest. And we're here, together, standing in the middle of Julian's apartment that's slowly becoming our apartment, our life, our story. I don't know what happens next. Neither of us does. But for the first time in my life, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with not having all the answers, with not knowing how the story ends. Because I know how this chapter begins, with honesty, with choice, with two people brave enough to reach for something real. And that's enough. It's more than enough. It's everything.